With Monster Hunter Wilds on the horizon, we're going back to Monster Hunter World to relive some of the best builds and hunts in the game. So with that, I'm Darcblade with one of the greatest builds for the Greatsword. Now, each one of these episodes is dedicated to just one build and are slightly different from the best of the best builds out there, as these tend to be a little bit more specialized, as in they focus on a specific monster or a specific type of gameplay style. But if you find these videos helpful or informative, consider leaving a like on the video as well as subscribing to the channel, as it does allow me to make more content like this, not only for Monster Hunter World, but also the upcoming Monster Hunter Wilds. So, in today's video we will be taking a look at the Frostcraft build for the Greatsword. Now, I've made a Frostcraft build before for the Greatsword, but it didn't go all out in terms of DPS. This build sacrifices quality of life and defensive skills in favour of maximising your potential DPS. Remember as well, before we get into this, that these builds are endgame builds, so they feature the rarest weaponry, decorations, armour, so on and so forth. There is some play around when it comes to decorations, as you may not have exactly what is shown in this video. So when it comes to this full out DPS Frostcraft Greatsword build, you'll need the following armour. First of all, you'll need the Rime Guard Helm Gamma, the Rime Guard Mail Gamma, then the Dragon Claws Beta, Rime Guard Coil Gamma, and the Rime Guard Greaves Gamma. As for your talisman, I'm using a Challenger Charm, but you can use something else if you so wish, depending on the decorations you have. And for my weapon, I'm using the Black Fatalis Blade. This has a health regen augmentation and an attack increase augmentation. As for the specialist tools and mantles, these are down to personal preference. Now, when it comes to the decorations, like I said, some of them can be flipped around here and there depending on what you have available to you. But first of all, I've gone for attack jewels to max out attack boost. I've then gone for expert jewels to max out critical eye, a resistor jewel for a point in blight resistance, tenderizer jewels to max out weakness exploit, critical jewels to max out critical boost, and then you'll have a jewel to kind of play around with, to which I've gone for a jumping and handicraft jewel to give us a point in evade extender for some extra quality of life, and a point in the handicraft skill. The decorations on your mantles, again, are down to personal preference in all honesty. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 150 health and 100 stamina, which will be 200 health and 150 stamina when you're on a hunt and taking all your relevant food buffs. You'll have a raw attack of 1,829, which when other buffs are kicked in will be much higher. You have a decent chunk of purple sharpness. It would be nice to get this higher, but the Greatsword doesn't have the issue of burning through sharpness too quickly. You have 15% base affinity, which will be 75% affinity when you take into account Agitator and Weakness Exploit. You have a dragon rating of 180 with high Elder Seal. You'll also have a decent defense of 1,121. That is strong against ice and water, slightly weak to thunder, but especially weak to dragon and fire. So when it comes to the skills for this build, first of all you have attack boost at level 7, increasing the raw attack of this build, and as the Greatsword specializes in raw attack, we'll want to try to get as much raw attack as we possibly can. On top of that, at level 4 or above, we also gain a percentage bonus to our base affinity. You'll then have critical eye at level 7, again increasing the base affinity of this build. Agitator at level 5, would have been nice to get this higher in all honesty, but Agitator at level 5 is still a wonderful skill, which when a monster becomes enraged, which is really easy to achieve in Monster Hunter World thanks to the whole flint shot and clutch pull mechanics, you'll gain increased raw attack and base affinity. You also have health boost at level 3, increasing our maximum health, which helps with survivability. You can drop this if you so wish, but I personally wouldn't recommend it. You'll then have ice attack at level 3, unfortunately a byproduct of the armor we are wearing. Unfortunately, we can't really get rid of this, so it's a wasted skill, unless you were to use a ice greatsword, but to be honest, we're using the Fatalis Greatsword because of its massive raw attack and decoration slots. You'll then have critical boost at level 3, increasing the damage of our attacks whenever they crit a monster, but it only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion. But this build is all about raw attack, so it's a must-have skill. You'll then have weakness exploit at level 3, a skill which increases our affinity by up to 50% when we're attacking monster weak points. Should these weak points be tenderized first, we get the full 50%, if not, we only get a small portion of it. You'll then have Focus at level 3, a wonderful quality of life skill for the Greatsword, which allows you to perform your charged attacks more quickly. Basically, it allows you to charge up the Greatsword swings at a quicker rate. You'll then have Critical Draw at level 3, which is a byproduct of the armor we're using, but it is good, especially for the Greatsword, which at level 3 grants us a 100% affinity when we perform drawing attacks. And should our first attack be a charged attack, it means that we can perform quite powerful opening attacks with this build. You then have Peak Performance at level 3, which is a skill that when our health is full, will gain increased raw attack. This is useful when used in conjunction with the health regen augmentation, as it allows us to potentially heal ourselves when performing our true charge / combo before the final hit of that attack hits a monster. You'll then have Quick Sheath at level 3, another byproduct of the armor, but it is a useful skill for the greatsword that allows us to sheath the weapon more quickly, which to be honest for this build is definitely kind of needed when we take into account Frostcraft, which we'll talk about in a moment. You'll then have Coalescence at level 3, which is a skill that when we remove a harmful blight or ailment from our hunter, will gain increased raw attack, elemental attack, and status attack. And as a lot of the endgame monsters like Vitalis, Alatreon, so on and so forth, they all specialize in various elements. Coalescence can be activated quite quickly, which brings us on to the next skill, which is Blight Resistance. Now I've only taken 1 point in Blight Resistance, as it's mainly there to help remove blights more quickly, thus activating Coalescence more frequently. It means that we don't necessarily have to sheathe our weapon, take a Nullberry, as the Blight Resistance should be enough to remove most blights from our hunters without having to bring ourselves out of combat too much. You'll then have Handicraft at level 1, which is an optional skill thanks to our decorations. This increases the sharpness of our weapon a little bit. You'll then have Resuscitate at level 1, which is a useful skill that when we are inflicted by a blight or ailment, will gain reduced stamina consumption and increased evasion capabilities. So a useful defensive buff for when we actually are inflicted by a blight. You'll then have Evade Extender at level 1, increasing the distance at which we dodge and evade and such, which is useful for the greatsword to be honest, especially if you have the weapon drawn. And then finally you have Dragon Attack at level 2, which is a result of the mantles, having the dragon attack decorations. You can replace this with whatever you wish. These simply just increase the dragon attack of the weapon slightly. It's not really needed that much. Now, as for the set bonuses, you'll have 2 of them, both of them attached to the Velkhana Divinity. First of all, you'll have Critical Element for wearing 2 pieces of the Velkhana armor set, which allows our attacks that crit a monster to deal increased elemental damage. However, this build isn't really about elemental damage, so it's kind of wasted a little bit on this build, but nonetheless, it's still a set bonus that can increase our damage slightly. And then, more importantly, we'll also have access to Frostcraft for wearing 4 pieces of the Velkhana armor. Frostcraft is a skill that gives us an additional gauge underneath our stamina and sharpness bar. There are certain thresholds on this gauge which fill up as our weapon is sheathed, to which when we actually start attacking and hitting a monster, it will start to consume this gauge, but the more the gauge is full, we'll gain a massive boost to our raw attack and elemental attack. So with the greatsword and how it plays, with its attacks being so infrequent, performing your true charge / combo and then sheathing your weapon and waiting for the Frostcraft buff to recharge itself is one of the key ways to play this build and optimize your damage with it. But there we have it, that is the full-on offensive Frostcraft build that I tend to use with the greatsword. But of course every build out there, even the endgame builds and best of the best builds, they all come with pros and cons. No build is absolutely perfect. When it comes to this offensive greatsword build, the biggest pro for it is its raw damage output, able to achieve some of the highest damage numbers in the game, so long as you're utilizing and making the most of the Frostcraft gauge. Which brings us on to the next pro, which this build is capable of what the community has dubbed snipes, as in it's able to perform hard-hitting draw attacks, which is a perfect counter for certain monsters such as Vitalis. And then finally the last pro is that this build is a raw attack build, despite having access to the dragon element, and thus it means it can be taken and used against pretty much any monster in the game, regardless of that monster's elemental or ailment resistances. But of course there are cons. The 2 major cons for this build include the fact that we have very few defensive skills. We don't have Divine Protection, Evade Window, anything like that to help keep us alive. And the other con is that unfortunately, even though it's not a huge issue, sometimes we will drop down from purple sharpness to white sharpness, depending on the length of the fight. But that being said, if you're looking for a greatsword build that utilizes the Frostcraft playstyle of dealing as much damage as you can in as few hits as possible, then I would strongly recommend this build. Like I said though, it does lack the quality of life and defensive aspects, and it's not the most comfy of greatsword builds in all honesty, but if you're looking for damage and want to bring down something quickly, this is a greatsword build I'd strongly recommend. But what are your thoughts? Please leave a comment down below, and until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you the offensive Frostcraft build for the greatsword in Monster Hunter World Iceborne. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.